So what is reference data? So we sort of break it into like a couple things. There's the most common use of reference data is about code values or lookup values or val values or enumerated lists. These are sort of the names that people talk about. Things like invoice status or grades or honors codes. Stuff that we'll talk about, like what is a reference data and what is not in a minute. But those are some examples. Also, there is some people who approach reference data from what you might call inventory lists standpoint. So not necessarily like a valid value, but more like a hierarchical structure of your general ledger numbers and their breakdown or catalog items. In the higher ed world, that might be like actually your catalog, or maybe more like a product catalog. Seed codes is an interesting example. Seed codes, that's a higher ed term, but those are institutional code values for organizations. So really, it is not more traditional sort of status or codes, but really like this hierarchical inventory where understanding that list is important. The important kind of distinction here is that we're really talking about reference information versus transactional information, right? So transactional information is, like lists of names or people or dates or activities and things like that that's going on and in your system. But the reference are the things that are fairly static information is getting pointed to by multiple things, kind of the setup and values of your world and the systems you're operating. So it's important to note that not all foreign keys from a database standpoint should be considered reference data lists, because many of those are pointed to transactional information. Foreign key being a pointer from one bit of information to another, right? So how do you kind of tell the difference between reference data? And these are sort of our general guidelines, but in my opinion, it's something that's typically less than 100 values, not necessarily. These are not hard rules. The changes vary infrequently, right? So it's not something that every week you're going to get a new value in. It's something that's fairly stable. It's something that is used as the defining attribute for other data objects. So therefore, like changes may have a big impact beyond the value themselves. So if you are an employment status and you have employees and things like that have the status as one of their values, it's defining that. And if you were to change that status or delete that status, it has big impact. Also, things from a pragmatic standpoint, which is what we focus on in our data governance approach, is really, you can kind of think of reference data from the point of view of data governance, is to say that these are things that benefit from a level of governance or approval review before you change the values in that list. So here's so as you're thinking about things that you want to try to track, these are some good points. So let's take some examples. So does it matter? Does it matter like whether or not in your the thing that you're deciding to document is as reference data is officially reference data or not, right? Or if you were to go in the data management book of knowledge or whatever, body of knowledge, and ask, is this reference data? Is it? It doesn't really matter, in my opinion, whether or not it is. But what matters is, from a pragmatic data governance perspective, I said, is it, is it worth your time to add these reference data value, to treat these as reference data values for things that you don't care, need, or plan to manage. So if you feel that there is a need, or you care about, or you plan to manage this information, then you can treat it like a reference data. Otherwise, you can think of it transactional, like we don't really care. I'm not going to try to prove it. It's not going to have big impact. Doesn't change very often. All right. So let's talk about some examples to kind of walk through this. So I've already mentioned employment status, active, full-time, part-time, whatever those things may be. That's a really good, straightforward example. Gender is a good example. That's something that has changed. There's a lot more gender codes than there used to be, depending on your perspective on this. But those are defining attributes of other things, right? So those are pretty obvious, right? So the next set is states and provinces. Well, all right. So now we're pushing up against this is sort of a North American central view, but then we're pushing up over 100 items between states and provinces here, and but they don't change very often, and they're pretty good reference data values, right? And particularly if you're talking about, are you looking at sort of the postal code values or descriptions and all that. Zip codes, I don't know, like there's a lot there, but they don't change very often. So you can think about that. I would say zip codes are probably not reference data, but they're more sort of inventory in the sense of reference data. NAICS codes are kind of interesting. I don't know if you know what those are, but they're in the news very recently. If you saw, was it yesterday that they released the federal government released the information about small businesses or businesses that received the PPP loan. And in that document, because I'm a data nerd, I downloaded and looked at it. They list the NAICS codes for everybody who's received one of these loans, and that's actually a a national code that describes corporations by what they do. And it's kind of an interesting thing because it's like a 5 or 6 digit code, and the first 2 or 3 digits represent sort of a category. Though it's like professional services or retail or whatever, and then the next codes get into more detail. So that's what we call roll-up values, which is kind of interesting. So I would say that NAICS codes are really good reference data, but there's also hundreds of them, right? So it's a bigger list, but I think that's a really good thing. And one of the things that adds that value is it has these roll-up values. So the first 3 values are also a separate list, right? So the 541, which I think is like computer services, that's, those first 3 digits are, can be in a separate list with the roll-up codes. All right, so those are interesting, maybe not thought-provoking, and we like the roll-up values. All right, going to our higher ed roots here, sections are, if you think of a section that you've, a course section that you've taken, you've got like Math 101, O1L, Fall 2020, right? That's basically the description of the section. I would classify a section as not a reference data value. It's very transactional, but it is, if you're tracking it from an inventory standpoint, it does fall in that category. But within this section, you've got your course, which is like Math 101. So there's a roll up there, and that's beginning to maybe be something that's reference data. But then you have like a subject, math, and that's probably like very obvious of a reference data. Instructional method, so this is like a lab, and that's a lab code, right? And then terms, which I would say, those are changing fairly often, and there's a lot to them. So you can decide about. Now again, don't, I'm being wishy-washy on this, not necessarily because I'm kind of playing around with it. The reality is it doesn't really matter. There's sort of this scale that you can, wherever you want to fall on with this about whether it matters. But the important things to you and your data governance is, do you think it's worth tracking and managing the changes to this list and the impact of a change to this list enough that you want to put it in a governance structure of a reference data, right? You probably don't want to do that with, the names of customers. That's ridiculous. That's transaction data. But for reference data values, it might make sense, okay? So, all right, what else we got? Now, this is kind of interesting. Now, we're going to go kind of the other perspective. And I remember when I first started out as a programmer and a data analyst, I had a very long debate with someone about whether or not you should take Boolean values and make them reference data lists, right? So this is things like true, false, yes, no, Y, N, flags like that, right? The other thing is it's sort of interesting because you've got true, false, but you also have maybe like undetermined, like we haven't decided yet, which is different than undefined, meaning that no one's even looked at it yet, right? So what's important about this is like, does it matter about tracking those codes, understanding the method of it? In the Boolean though, you start bumping up against really what you're talking about here is more like data typing than you are about reference data lists. So most people would not put true, false as a reference data. But that information is really important to be tracked around your data and your definitions, because if you're trying to build a report and you want to say, we want to select everybody who, has a value of true in this particular field, you need to know, are you checking for true? Are you checking for Y? Are you checking for yes? If it's blank, does that like default to true, or does it default to false, or is it mean nothing? Those are things that matter. So documenting that's really important, but probably not in a reference data list. All right. So mind blown with that one, hopefully. All right, so let's talk about the product inventory example. So some of you who come from like manufacturing or other things, this is where you think about it. So it's a very hierarchical structure. So you might have a SKU, right, which is you're at the lowest level, which is a particular product, right, your retail. But you might have a product line. Oh, this is clothing, and then you might have clothing, you might have accessories, you might have other things, and then within that clothing you have underwear as the thing, and then the type, men's briefs, and the brand is Calvin Klein, and the color is purple, and the size is medium. So these are all examples. Many of these are reference data values, and there's interdependencies between them. Like you have a set of valid kind of product types within the product category, maybe, right? Or valid product categories within the product line. Now, this is not a coincidence that I chose men's purple Calvin Klein briefs. If you've already got this reference, congratulations. But it's kind of interesting because we did a demo the other day for Calvin Klein, actually, the company or the parent company of them around data management. They brought up really interesting topics around how they're tracking reference data inventory management. You know, particularly as a global company, there's debate about, you know, what's a sweater versus a jumper, and is this particular product fall in that category? And if they're trying to compare sales and manage things across the entire globe, understanding these reference data values and how things fall into it is really important. All right, so if anyone understood this reference, you know, I had that conversation with Calvin Klein like a couple months ago, and then just last week, I, with my kids, were watching a video and movie for the very first time, and this reference comes from, the SKU is actually They Call Me Marty. It's from Back to the Future, where she finds Marty, her mother in the time, and thinks his name is Calvin Klein because it's written on his purple underwear.